Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're taking a look at literally the ultimate mystery of the human experience. What actually happens when we die? You know, it's a question that's haunted philosophers, terrified us mortals, and inspired endless devotion since the dawn of time. But today, we're not just dusting off ancient texts. We're going to look at this fascinating intersection where hard medical science, deeply held religious doctrines, and mind-bending near-death experiences all completely collide. We've got an incredible deck prepared for you today that pulls from clinical data, spiritual teachings, and even the first-hand accounts of doctors themselves. Okay, let's dive into this. First, we'll look at the physical dying process. Second, consciousness beyond the body. Third, reincarnation versus the light. Fourth, doctors experiencing the afterlife. And finally, how science explains the unknown.
Section 1. The physical dying process.
To ground ourselves in the medical facts, let's look at the actual biological reality of death. It really isn't just a single sudden moment, right? It's a gradual process of the body slowly shutting down. First, your vitals decline. Respiration slows way down, and your body temperature drops as the heart just kind of loses its ability to pump oxygen-rich blood. Second, as death gets closer, there are some profound sensory changes. The brain often releases this massive surge of chemicals, which can actually heighten awareness or create this wild state of hyperreality. Third, the person drifts into unconsciousness. But, and this is an incredibly fascinating medical reality supported by places like the Cleveland Clinic, research suggests that hearing and touch are actually the very last senses to go. So even in a deep, coma-like state, a dying person might still feel a comforting touch or hear loved ones talking to them. And then finally, vital organ failure kicks in. The heart, breath, and brain just completely stop functioning. Section 2. Consciousness beyond the body. Now, let's pivot from the physical shutdown to the subjective side of things. When people are brought back from the absolute brink of death, their stories are shockingly consistent. I'm talking across different ages, completely different cultures, and diverse backgrounds. They frequently report this feeling of detaching from their physical body. A lot of times they describe floating right up above and watching doctors perform CPR on them. Crazy, right? Then, they often describe traveling through a dark passageway or a tunnel, moving toward this really radiant, warm light. Many go through a whole life review, re-experiencing significant events and reflecting on their past actions. They also constantly report reconnecting with deceased loved ones or spiritual beings, all while feeling this absolutely overwhelming, transcendent sense of peace. For those who do come back, these universally shared near-death experiences, or NDEs, often lead to profound spiritual awakenings and pretty much erase their fear of death entirely. Section 3. Reincarnation versus the light. Let's see how all this builds by comparing these linear NDE reports with the complex narratives found in ancient religious texts. On one hand, we have Hindu texts, like the Garuda Purana, describing a highly specific cyclical process. It states that a soul might go through up to 8.4 million births across completely different forms of life before finally getting a human body. After death, the soul is judged by Yamraj, the Lord of Death, based entirely on its karma, and the physical body is cremated, specifically to release the soul so it doesn't get trapped. It's this vast, continuous cycle of judgment and rebirth. Now contrast that with your typical NDE reports, which describe a very linear transition. You leave the body, travel straight toward a light, and experience immediate peace and reflection, rather than jumping right into a cycle of rebirth or immediate judgment. Both are super profound models for understanding what might come next. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how these near-death experiences can actually blur those expected religious boundaries. We have documented cases of cross-cultural anomalies that are just wild. For instance, there's a reported case of a Hindu man named Santosh and another of a young Muslim boy. Both had near-death experiences, and despite their distinct religious backgrounds, both reported traveling through that classic tunnel of light and actually encountering Jesus Christ sitting on a throne. These anomalies are incredible because they really challenge the assumption that a dying brain simply hallucinates whatever its specific culture conditioned it to expect. Section 4. Doctors experience the afterlife. Okay, to set the stage here, let's look at the hardline scientific materialist perspective. This was famously summarized by the brilliant physicist Stephen Hawking. He essentially said, "The brain is a computer which will stop working when its components fail. There is no heaven or afterlife for broken-down computers. That is a fairy story for people afraid of the dark." So for Hawking and a lot of like-minded, highly science-minded individuals, the afterlife is really just a human invention to help us cope with our fear of mortality. When the biology stops, consciousness stops. End of story. It's a really compelling, logical argument. But what about the doctors who came back? Seriously, what actually happens when the very people trained to view the body as a biological machine suddenly find themselves floating right outside of it? The first-hand accounts of medical professionals are arguably the most fascinating ones out there. Take these two Belgian doctors, Dr. Raymond and Dr. Dean. Both suffered severe heart attacks that resulted in a total loss of oxygen to the brain. Dr. Raymond's reported passing through a dark tunnel, straight into a brilliant, welcoming light where a voice actually spoke to him. Meanwhile, Dr. Dean experienced this incredibly vivid out-of-body sensation. He described his consciousness sitting on a cloud, looking down in absolute terror at his own lifeless body on the hospital bed. Because of their strict scientific training, these doctors obviously expected their consciousness to just fade to black. But instead, they had these profound, belief-altering spiritual experiences that totally defied everything they ever learned in medical school. Section 5. Science explains the unknown. And this brilliantly illustrates the ongoing debate between spirituality and science, because modern neuroscience attempts to debunk these narratives by mapping out exact biological explanations for pretty much every major spiritual symptom. Let's break it down. You see a tunnel? Well, the spiritual view says it's the soul's passageway, but science says it's retinal ischemia, basically a loss of blood flow to the eyes causing your peripheral vision to fail. What about the light? Spiritually, it's a benevolent presence. Scientifically, it's just a massive chemical surge in your failing visual system. Feeling out of body? Science argues that's simply a processing error in the brain's spatial perception network, not your soul actually detaching. And that profound life review? Neurologists suggest that when the brain senses extreme fatal danger, it frantically scans its strongest memories, looking for some kind of survival mechanism. Which brings us to the number 7. This represents a truly mind-bending scientific theory. Some neuroscientists suggest that when the heart stops, the dying brain might actually have up to a 7-minute window of residual activity. And since time perception is completely altered in the brain anyway, those 7 minutes of firing synapses could literally feel like an eternity. In those 7 minutes, your brain could theoretically construct an entire lifetime's worth of memories, a comprehensive judgment process, or a vivid journey to the afterlife, all playing out in your mind just moments before total biological shutdown. So the crucial point we're left with is this. If our brains construct the afterlife as they shut down, is it merely a biological illusion, a final comforting dream generated by a dying machine? Or, as the experiencers passionately argue, is that biological process actually the door opening to what comes next? Whether you side with the ancient texts, the hard biological realities, or the near-death survivors, one thing is absolutely certain: our consciousness is incredibly powerful. Understanding how we view death fundamentally changes how we choose to live our lives right now. It's a wild thing to think about. Thanks so much for joining me on The Explainer today. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you in the next one.